My daughter-in-law was breastfeeding in my kitchen when she smirked and asked if I wanted to hold my grandson. The moment I saw his birthmark, my world shattered. That mark belonged to my dead husband. Before we start, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. Margaret Chen had spent 68 years building a life defined by love and sacrifice. Every single decision she'd ever made had been for someone else. First for her parents, immigrant workers who'd scraped together every penny to give her opportunities they never had. Then for her beloved husband Robert, whom she'd married at 22 and loved with a devotion that never wavered through 43 years of marriage. And finally, most intensely, for her only son, David. A retired elementary school teacher, Margaret was the kind of woman who remembered not just every student's name, but their favorite colors, their fears, their dreams. She'd spent 35 years shaping young minds in the same Philadelphia public school, often buying supplies with her own money when the district budget ran dry. She kept boxes of granola bars in her desk for kids who came to school hungry. She stayed late to tutor students whose parents worked multiple jobs. Her classroom had been a sanctuary, and her former students still sent her cards every Christmas, still stopped her in grocery stores to introduce their own children. But her greatest love, her most profound investment, had always been her family. Margaret was the woman who kept photo albums organized by year, with handwritten notes documenting every memory. She never missed a birthday or anniversary. She could recite everyone's favorite meals from memory and would cook them without being asked. Her small suburban home in a quiet neighborhood outside Philadelphia was always open, always warm, always filled with the smell of fresh cookies or homemade soup simmering on the stove. When Robert died 3 years ago from a sudden heart attack, something inside Margaret had broken in a way she wasn't sure could ever be repaired. They'd been planning their retirement dream trip to Ireland. They'd been married for over 4 decades, and she'd never spent a single night without him. The grief had been crushing, suffocating, a weight that made it hard to breathe some mornings. But Margaret had pushed through it the only way she knew how, by giving herself completely to what remained of her family. She'd thrown herself even deeper into helping David and his wife Rachel prepare for their first child. She babysat without complaint whenever they needed her, often canceling her own plans without a second thought. She contributed financially to their lives without being asked, slipping checks into birthday cards, paying for the nursery furniture, covering their grocery bills when money seemed tight. She loved without condition, without keeping score, because that's what mothers did. That's what family meant to her. After Robert's death, Margaret had found new purpose in preparing for her first grandchild. She'd converted Robert's old study into a nursery for when they visited, carefully selecting paint colors and filling the room with the same stuffed animals she'd saved from David's childhood. She researched the best car seats, read parenting books so she could offer helpful advice, and knitted tiny blankets during lonely evenings. Margaret believed family was everything. She believed blood ties were sacred and unbreakable. She believed that the love she poured into her son would create a foundation of loyalty and care that would sustain them all. That belief was about to destroy her completely. Margaret's days followed a peaceful rhythm she'd carefully constructed after Robert's death, a routine that kept the loneliness at bay and gave her life structure and meaning. Every morning began at exactly 6 o'clock, no alarm needed. Her body had learned this schedule over decades. She'd shuffle to the kitchen in the slippers Robert had given her their last Christmas together, make coffee in the old percolator he'd refused to replace, despite her offers to buy a modern machine, and carry her steaming mug out to the porch swing he'd built with his own hands 30 years ago. That swing was her sanctuary. She'd sit there wrapped in an afghan her mother had crocheted, watching the sun rise over the neighborhood while talking to Robert's photo propped on the small table beside her. She'd tell him about her plans for the day, about things she'd seen on the news, about how much she missed his terrible jokes and the way he'd hum off-key while doing dishes. The neighbors probably thought she was losing her mind, but Margaret didn't care. Those morning conversations with Robert kept him alive in her heart. After coffee, she'd tend her garden, the one Robert had helped her plant and expand over 40 years of marriage. The roses he'd given her for their 25th anniversary still bloomed faithfully every spring, deep red and fragrant. The tomato plants they'd grown together produced fruit so sweet she'd cry sometimes while eating them, remembering his hands in the soil beside hers. She'd deadhead flowers, pull weeds, and water everything with the care of someone tending sacred ground, because it was sacred. Every plant held a memory. Her week had its own comforting pattern. Tuesdays meant volunteering at the local library, where she'd read to children during story hour. Her teacher instincts never fully retired. Thursdays brought book club with women she'd known for decades, friends who understood her grief because they'd lost husbands too. Sundays were for church, sitting in the same pew she and Robert had occupied for 40 years, followed by lunch with David and Rachel at various restaurants around town. But everything had changed 2 months ago, when her grandson was born. Margaret's world, which had felt so gray and diminished after Robert's death, suddenly blazed with color again. She had a purpose beyond mere survival. She had someone new to love, someone who needed her. She'd converted Robert's old study into a nursery for when they visited, painting the walls a soft yellow and filling it with stuffed animals she'd saved from David's childhood. Each toy held a story she planned to tell her grandson someday. Rachel seemed genuinely grateful for her help, constantly texting photos of the baby, always accepting Margaret's offers to babysit or bring over homemade meals. Margaret would rush over at a moment's notice, her heart full, feeling needed and valued again. She'd rock the baby while Rachel napped, singing the same lullabies she'd sung to David decades ago. She'd fold tiny laundry, wash bottles, and tidy their home while they rested, never asking for thanks, because the privilege of helping was reward enough. The loneliness that had haunted her since Robert's funeral was finally fading. Margaret felt useful again, essential to her family's happiness. She'd even started thinking about selling her big house and moving closer to David's family, maybe even helping with a down payment on a larger home where they could all live together. She imagined holidays with multiple generations, imagined growing old, surrounded by love and laughter. Life felt whole again, purposeful, full of promise. She had absolutely no idea she was living in a carefully constructed lie. It started with something small during one of Margaret's weekly visits, the kind of detail so minor that most people would have missed it entirely. She was at David and Rachel's apartment on a Wednesday afternoon, washing dishes while Rachel nursed the baby in the kitchen behind her. Margaret loved these moments, the domestic comfort of caring for her family while soft sunlight streamed through the windows. She was humming one of Robert's favorite songs, her hands deep in soapy water, when she turned to ask Rachel if she wanted more tea. That's when she saw it. Rachel's fingers moved with startling speed across her phone screen, and the moment Margaret's eyes landed on her, Rachel practically slammed the phone face down on the counter. The movement was sharp, almost violent, completely unlike Rachel's usual calm demeanor. For just a fraction of a second, Margaret caught a glimpse of what looked like a spreadsheet or document, numbers and columns, but it vanished too quickly to be sure. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice light and casual. Rachel's smile seemed forced, stretched too tight across her face. "Oh, just work stuff. Nothing important." But her hand remained protectively over the phone, and she shifted her body slightly, as if blocking Margaret's view of something. Margaret turned back to the dishes, but her mind was churning. Rachel was on maternity leave. She didn't have work emails to check. And why the guilty reaction? Why hide the screen so aggressively? Margaret scrubbed a plate harder than necessary, telling herself she was being ridiculous. Then there was the comment about Hawaii. Later that same afternoon, Rachel mentioned casually while burping the baby that they were planning a family trip to the islands in the spring. "We're so excited," Rachel said, her eyes bright. "It'll be the baby's first real vacation." "Oh, how wonderful," Margaret replied, already mentally calculating what she could contribute to help with expenses. "Where are you thinking of staying? I could help research hotels, or maybe I could watch the baby some evenings so you two could have romantic dinners." Rachel's smile faltered. She glanced toward the hallway where David was supposedly napping, then looked back at Margaret with an expression that seemed almost pitying. "Oh, well, it's mostly for the three of us, you know. Bonding time. Young family stuff." The words hit Margaret like a slap, though Rachel's tone remained sweet. "Of course," Margaret heard herself say, forcing brightness into her voice even as something cold settled in her stomach. "You absolutely need that time together." But the exclusion stung. She'd been to Hawaii with Robert years ago. She knew the islands well and could have offered wonderful recommendations. More than that, she'd assumed she was part of their family unit now, especially with the baby. Wasn't that what grandmothers did? Join family vacations? She'd been on trips with her own mother when David was small. The worst moment came later that week when Margaret stopped by unexpectedly to drop off a casserole she'd made. She let herself in with the key Rachel had given her months ago, calling out a greeting. David's voice drifted from the bedroom, sharp and hushed. "She doesn't need to know yet. We'll tell her when it's done." Margaret froze in the hallway, casserole growing heavy in her hands. She couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, just David's responses. I know. Just keep her happy for now. The timing has to be right." When Margaret knocked on the bedroom door, David emerged looking flustered, his face flushed. "Mom, I didn't know you were coming." "I brought dinner. Who are you talking to?" "Just work," he said too quickly. Then, seeing her skeptical expression, he added, "Actually, we're planning a surprise for your birthday. Don't ruin it by asking questions." Margaret wanted to believe him. She desperately wanted to believe him. But her birthday was 8 months away in June. Who planned surprises 8 months in advance? And why had he looked so guilty, so caught? That night, lying in the bed she'd shared with Robert, Margaret stared at the ceiling and couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying those 3 moments like a loop of film she couldn't stop. The hidden phone, the excluded trip, the secretive conversation. Individually, each one could be explained away innocently. Together, they formed a pattern she didn't want to see. Something felt wrong, like a discordant note in a familiar song she'd been hearing her whole life. But she couldn't identify exactly what it was, and that uncertainty terrified her more than any concrete knowledge could have. Margaret spent the next several days talking herself out of her own suspicions, building elaborate explanations for everything she'd witnessed. She sat at her kitchen table with her morning coffee, Robert's photo looking at her from the mantel, and methodically convinced herself she was being paranoid and foolish. Grief did strange things to the mind. Her therapist, Dr. Morrison, had warned her about this exact tendency during their sessions after Robert's death. "Loss can make us hypervigilant," Dr. Morrison had explained. "You might find yourself looking for problems where none exist, trying to protect yourself from experiencing that kind of pain again." That had to be what this was. Margaret was projecting her fear of abandonment onto innocent situations. She was seeing shadows where there was only light, manufacturing drama, because some broken part of her psyche expected everyone she loved to leave her eventually, just like Robert had. Rachel hiding her phone? That was just normal privacy. Everyone had a right to private conversations and personal business. Margaret herself had things on her phone she wouldn't want others seeing. Not because they were nefarious, but simply because they were hers. Maybe Rachel was planning a surprise party for David. Maybe she was texting friends about personal matters. The guilty look Margaret thought she'd seen was probably just surprise at being interrupted. Nothing more sinister than that. The Hawaii comment? Margaret replayed that conversation in her mind, and now it seemed perfectly reasonable. Rachel had said young family bonding time. And what was wrong with that? New parents needed opportunities to connect as a unit, to establish their own family traditions without well-meaning grandparents hovering over every moment. Margaret remembered taking trips with just Robert and baby David, treasuring that intimate time together. She was being the overbearing mother-in-law she'd always promised herself she wouldn't become, the kind who couldn't respect boundaries, who expected to be included in everything. And David's phone conversation? Margaret felt her cheeks burn with shame when she reconsidered it. He'd specifically said it was a birthday surprise. Just because her birthday was months away didn't mean anything. Robert used to plan elaborate surprises for her that took months to arrange. One year, he'd secretly commissioned a portrait of them from their wedding photo, working with an artist for half a year. Maybe David was planning something equally thoughtful and time-intensive. Her suspicion was ruining what should be a lovely gesture. She was being ungrateful and paranoid. These people had been nothing but kind to her. After Robert died, David had called her every single day for months, just checking in, making sure she was eating, offering to help with anything she needed. Rachel had brought her meals, invited her to prenatal appointments, made her feel included in the pregnancy journey. They'd named the baby partly after Robert, for heaven's sake. They'd given her the gift of being a grandmother. That weekend, Margaret threw herself into making amends for her ugly, suspicious thoughts. She baked 3 dozen of Rachel's favorite lemon bars, the ones with the extra tart filling and the perfect golden crust. She volunteered to babysit for an entire weekend so Rachel and David could have a romantic getaway. She complimented Rachel's parenting skills profusely, praised David's career accomplishments, and pushed every uncomfortable feeling deep down into a dark place where it couldn't hurt anyone or damage these precious relationships. When she held her grandson, feeling his small weight in her arms, his tiny fingers curling around hers, Margaret felt genuinely ashamed of herself. How could she have doubted the people who'd given her this perfect, beautiful gift? What kind of bitter, broken woman suspected her own family of betrayal based on nothing but coincidences and misunderstandings? She looked at that sweet baby's face, at his button nose and rosebud mouth, and made herself a promise. She would be better. She would trust more. She would stop letting grief poison her perceptions and turn her into someone suspicious and small. Everything was fine. Her family loved her. She was safe and valued and needed. She forced herself to believe it with every fiber of her being because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The evidence arrived on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, the kind of beautiful autumn day that Robert had always loved. Margaret was babysitting while Rachel ran what she'd vaguely described as errands in the city. The baby had been fussy all morning, but finally, blessedly, he'd fallen asleep in the nursery upstairs. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, watching his tiny chest rise and fall, feeling that overwhelming rush of love that only grandchildren could inspire. With the baby sleeping peacefully, Margaret decided to make herself useful by tidying up the guest room. Rachel and David's apartment always seemed cluttered, with boxes and bags scattered in corners, and Margaret hated sitting idle. She was folding a stack of blankets that had been left on the guest bed when she noticed the closet door was slightly ajar. Inside, pushed toward the back behind winter coats, was a cardboard file box she'd never seen before. Margaret almost left it alone. She truly almost walked away. But something about the box nagged at her. It was labeled House Docs in Rachel's neat handwriting, which seemed odd because Rachel and David rented their apartment. They didn't own a house. What house documents could they possibly have? Her hands trembled slightly as she pulled the box down from the shelf. It was heavier than expected, packed full of papers. Margaret sat on the floor, her knees protesting, and lifted the lid. The first document made her breath catch. It was a professional property appraisal for her house, her address printed clearly at the top, dated from just 3 weeks ago. The estimated value was listed as $975,000. Margaret's house. Someone had paid for a formal appraisal of her home without telling her. Beneath that were printouts from websites about reverse mortgages, articles about estate planning for elderly homeowners, guides titled How to Talk to Aging Parents About Downsizing. Her address was highlighted throughout in bright yellow marker. Phrases jumped out at her: maximizing property value, convincing resistant seniors, legal approaches to property transfer. Her hands were shaking so badly now she could barely hold the papers. She kept digging. Bank statements appeared next, from an account she didn't recognize. The statements showed regular deposits labeled savings for house down payment going back 8 months. The total amount was already approaching $60,000. Where had they gotten that kind of money? Then came the spreadsheets, printed Excel documents with columns and calculations. One was titled Timeline for M's House. It outlined steps by month: November, get appraisal; December, present senior living options; January, obtain power of attorney; February, transfer title; March, list property; April, close sale; May, purchase new property. Margaret's whole life reduced to a 6-month timeline on a spreadsheet. But the note at the bottom of the box was what shattered her completely. It was handwritten on Rachel's personal stationery, the expensive kind with her monogram. The note was clearly a draft, full of crossed-out words and revisions, as if Rachel had been practicing her approach. Once the house is transferred, we sell within 90 days. Em won't fight if she thinks it's for the baby's college fund. David handles his mother. I handle the realtor. She's so eager to help with the baby, she'll sign anything we put in front of her. The key is making her feel like it's her idea, like she's being the generous grandmother. She won't even realize she's homeless until the sale is final. Margaret read those words 3 times, 4 times, hoping they would change or that she was misunderstanding. But there was no misunderstanding possible. The words were clear, cold, calculated. They were planning to take her home. They were planning to manipulate her, to use her love for her grandson as a weapon against her. They thought she was so pathetically desperate for family connection that she'd sign away everything she owned. The box fell from her lap, papers scattering across the guest room floor. Margaret sat frozen, her mind completely unable to process what her eyes had just seen. This was her home they were discussing so casually. The home she and Robert had bought 43 years ago with their combined teacher salaries, scraping together every penny for the down payment. The home where she'd brought baby David home from the hospital, where she'd nursed Robert through pneumonia, where they'd celebrated 42 anniversaries, where Robert had died in their bed, holding her hand. They wanted to take it from her. Her own son wanted to steal her home, make her homeless, and he'd enlisted his wife to help manipulate her into surrendering everything. From the nursery, the baby started crying, his wails cutting through Margaret's shock. She stood on legs that barely held her, her movements mechanical and dreamlike. She carefully returned every document to the box exactly as she'd found it, her hands operating on autopilot while her mind screamed. She placed the box back on the closet shelf in the precise position it had been, adjusting the winter coats to hide it again. Then she went to comfort her grandson, picking him up with trembling arms, her tears falling silently onto his soft hair while he nestled against her chest, completely unaware that his grandmother's heart was breaking into pieces that might never fit back together again. The full truth exploded during what was supposed to be a casual Sunday dinner at Margaret's house. She'd spent an entire week in silent agony after finding those documents, watching Rachel and David's every move like a detective studying suspects. She listened to every word for hidden meanings, analyzed every smile for traces of deception. Every interaction felt like walking through a minefield blindfolded. She'd nearly convinced herself 100 times that she'd misunderstood everything, that there was some innocent explanation she hadn't considered. But then Rachel made her move, and all of Margaret's desperate hopes crumbled to dust. It happened over dessert. Margaret had made Robert's famous apple pie, the recipe he'd perfected over decades, the one that always made David close his eyes in happiness with the first bite. She'd set it on the table still warm from the oven, steam rising from the lattice crust, filling her dining room with cinnamon and memories. She was cutting slices when Rachel suddenly placed a pristine manila folder beside Margaret's plate, positioned carefully next to her coffee cup. "We've been working on something really special for you, Margaret," Rachel said, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. Her smile was wide and bright, the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. David nodded enthusiastically, reaching across the table to squeeze his mother's hand. "Mom, we know how hard these past few years have been for you. How lonely you've been in this big house all by yourself. We think it's time for a change, a positive change." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Her hand stilled on the pie server. What kind of change? Rachel opened the folder with a practiced flourish, spreading glossy brochures across the table like a salesperson making a pitch. The largest brochure showed a modern building with huge windows and smiling elderly people engaged in various activities. Sunset Meadows Senior Living Community was printed across the top in cheerful letters. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Rachel continued, her finger pointing to photos of spacious common areas, manicured gardens, activity rooms. "They have movie nights, art classes, book clubs. You'd be surrounded by people your own age. You'd never be lonely again." Beneath the brochures were legal documents. Margaret recognized them from her frantic research over the past week. A quitclaim deed to transfer her house title to David for estate planning purposes and tax benefits. A durable power of attorney giving David control over her financial decisions. Application forms for Sunset Meadows with monthly costs highlighted, costs that would conveniently consume her savings within 3 years. "We've already toured the facility," David added, his voice gentle in that particular way people use when talking to children or the elderly. "There's a unit available now, 2nd floor, lots of natural light. We could move you in as early as next month." "Move me in," Margaret repeated slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Next month." "And this way," Rachel interjected smoothly, tapping the property transfer document. "David can manage the house properly. We're thinking of renting it out initially, which would help cover your care costs at Sunset Meadows. Eventually, when the market is right, we might sell. But you don't need to worry about any of that. We'll handle everything." Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, waiting for some sign that this was Rachel's idea alone, waiting for him to say he'd never betray his mother this way, waiting for the David she'd raised, the boy she'd sacrificed everything for, to appear behind this stranger's face. But David just squeezed her hand again and said, with what sounded like genuine concern, "It's really for the best, Mom. You're not getting any younger. What if you fell down these stairs? What if something happened and no one found you for days? This house is too much for you to handle alone." Something crystallized inside Margaret in that moment. Something that had been forming all week but now hardened into absolute clarity. Her son was looking at her the way she'd looked at her own elderly students, with patience and pity, like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be respected. "When did you plan this?" Margaret asked quietly, her voice eerily calm. Rachel and David exchanged a quick glance. "Well," Rachel admitted, settling back in her chair with the confidence of someone who thought they'd already won. "We've been thinking about it seriously since your husband died. Even before, actually. We realized then that this house was just too much for one person." Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret discovered the full scope of their plan, and each new revelation was worse than the last. She hired a private investigator named Marcus Chen, a recommendation from her lawyer friend Patricia, whom she'd called in tears the night after that devastating dinner. Marcus was ex-FBI, specializing in financial crimes and family fraud. Margaret paid him from a secret account Robert had left her, money David didn't know existed, money Robert had insisted she keep, just in case you ever need independence. Robert had known. Somehow, her husband had known to protect her. Marcus's first report arrived via encrypted email 6 days later. Margaret sat at her kitchen table reading it on her laptop, her reading glasses sliding down her nose, her hands growing colder with each page. The conspiracy went back further than she'd imagined. Much further. David and Rachel had been planning this for over 18 months, since before Robert's death. There were email chains Marcus had obtained through methods Margaret didn't want to know about. Conversations between Rachel and her sister Diane, who was a real estate agent. In one email dated 14 months ago, Rachel had written, "Once the old man dies, we move on the mother. She'll be vulnerable and desperate for family connection. That's when we strike." The old man. They'd called Robert the old man like he was an obstacle, an inconvenience. Margaret had to stop reading and cry into her hands, grief and rage mixing into something toxic. The emails revealed they'd consulted with a lawyer specializing in elder law, specifically asking about legal methods to obtain property from resistant elderly parents. They'd researched conservatorship proceedings, discussing the possibility of having Margaret declared mentally incompetent if she refused to cooperate voluntarily. Rachel had written, "We need medical documentation of cognitive decline. Can we get a doctor to say she's showing signs of dementia? David says she forgets things sometimes." Margaret didn't forget things. She was sharper than most people half her age, but they were willing to lie, to create false medical records, to destroy her reputation and autonomy, just to steal her property. Marcus also uncovered Rachel's sister, Diane's involvement. She had a listing agreement already drafted for Margaret's house, dated for 3 months in the future. The commission would be 6% of the sale price, nearly $60,000. Diane had already identified 3 potential buyers, wealthy developers interested in tearing down the old house to build a modern McMansion. Margaret's home, where she'd raised her son and loved her husband, would be demolished within months of the sale. But the worst discovery was about the life insurance. Robert had carried a policy worth $500,000 with Margaret as the sole beneficiary. She'd received that money after his death and deposited it in a savings account, unsure what to do with it, unable to spend money that represented her husband's death. For 6 months, David had been pressuring her to sign the money over to a trust for the baby's future. He'd brought her documents from a financial planning firm run by his college friend, Brett. What Marcus discovered made Margaret physically ill. The trust was designed to give David complete control as trustee, with management fees of 15% annually. Brett's firm would charge additional advisory fees and administrative costs. Between them, they'd drain the entire $500,000 within 7 years. The emails between David and Brett were breathtaking in their casual cruelty. Brett had written, "Your mom won't understand the fee structure. Just tell her it's standard. By the time she realizes how much is gone, she'll be too old to fight it. Plus, she'll be dependent on you by then. So what's she going to do?" David's response, "Perfect. She's so desperate to feel useful and needed that she'll sign anything if I tell her it's for her grandson. The key is keeping her emotionally dependent and grateful." Margaret had to run to the bathroom and vomit. Marcus's investigation revealed more. They'd calculated her life expectancy using actuarial tables. Based on her age and health, they'd estimated she had 12 to 15 years left. Their plan was to isolate her in Sunset Meadows, sell her house, drain her life insurance through the fraudulent trust, and wait for her to die. They'd even discussed what to do with her belongings. Rachel had emailed her sister, "Most of the furniture is outdated junk. We'll donate it and claim the tax deduction, though that china set might be worth something." That china set had been Margaret's grandmother's, brought from Italy in 1920. Each piece was a family heirloom. Rachel thought it was junk. The final email Marcus uncovered was dated just 1 week ago, sent from Rachel to David late at night. "Is your mom signing the papers Sunday or not? I'm tired of pretending to like her. The baby smell comment she made was annoying, and she keeps rearranging my kitchen when she visits. Once we have the house, we can cut her off completely. Mandatory visiting hours at Sunset Meadows are only once a month." Margaret read that email 10 times, each word carving deeper into her heart. Once we have the house, we can cut her off completely. They'd planned her entire erasure. They'd mapped out how to steal everything she owned, isolate her from the world, and discard her like garbage. And they'd done it while smiling to her face, letting her hold her grandson, accepting her money and her cooking, and her unconditional love. Her own son had calculated her death date and planned accordingly. Margaret sat in the silent house that night, surrounded by 43 years of memories they wanted to demolish, and felt something shift inside her. The grief and shock were still there, but underneath grew something harder, colder, stronger. They thought she was a helpless old woman, too naive and desperate to fight back. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. "This house is worth almost $1 million now," Rachel continued, her mask slipping slightly, letting naked greed show through. "And you're here alone, rattling around in all this space. It's just wasted. The equity is wasted. You could be somewhere safe while we make practical use of a valuable asset." "Wasted," Margaret repeated. The word hung in the air like poison gas, seeping into every corner of the dining room where she'd served thousands of family meals. Her home, her life, her 43 years of memories, wasted. Robert's apple pie sat cooling on the table between them, still untouched. No one had taken a single bite. That night, Margaret sat in the bedroom she'd shared with Robert for 40 years and finally allowed herself to completely shatter. She'd been holding herself together through sheer willpower since finding those documents, functioning on autopilot, maintaining the facade of normalcy. But alone in the darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of her life, the dam finally broke. She pulled out their wedding album from the cedar chest at the foot of the bed, her fingers trembling as she opened the leather cover. The pages crackled with age, the photographs faded to sepia tones that made the past feel impossibly distant. There was Robert at 24, impossibly young and handsome in his rented tuxedo, looking at her like she was the only woman in the world. There she was at 22, her mother's veil cascading down her back, her eyes bright with hope and dreams. "I failed, Robert," Margaret whispered to Pintu, the empty room, her voice cracking. "I failed us. I raised a monster and I didn't even know it." The memories crashed over her in devastating waves. David as a newborn, red-faced and screaming, placed in her arms for the first time. The overwhelming surge of love she'd felt, so powerful it was almost frightening. She'd promised that tiny baby she would give him everything, protect him from everything, love him beyond reason. David's first day of kindergarten, crying and clinging to her leg. She'd held him until he calmed, whispering that he was brave, that she'd be right there waiting when school ended. And she had been, every single day for years. David's high school graduation, where he'd thanked her in his valedictorian speech, calling her his hero and inspiration. She'd cried tears of pride, convinced she'd done something right, raised someone good. David's wedding day, when he'd held her close during their dance and whispered, "I'll always take care of you, Mom, always, I promise." Had it all been lies? Had she been blind from the beginning? She thought about every sacrifice she'd made, working 2 jobs while Robert worked one, both of them exhausted but determined to pay for David's college education without loans. She'd taught summer school for 15 years straight, giving up vacations and rest so David could attend his dream university. She'd postponed her own master's degree, the one Robert had encouraged her to pursue, because the money needed to go to David instead. When David wanted to buy his first car, she'd emptied her savings account. When he needed help with his wedding, she'd taken a loan against the house. When he asked for a down payment contribution on his apartment, she'd cashed in bonds she'd been saving for retirement. And this was her reward. This was what unconditional love had earned her. A son who viewed her as an asset to be liquidated, a problem to be managed, an obstacle between him and $1 million. Margaret looked around the bedroom at Robert's reading chair, still positioned by the window where he'd spent countless evenings with his mystery novels. At the quilt her mother had made them as a wedding gift, hand-stitched over months of careful work. At the growth chart on the closet door frame marking David's childhood heights in faded pencil, each line labeled with a date and age. They wanted to take all of this. They wanted to sell it to strangers, erase 43 years of life and love, bulldoze the physical evidence that she and Robert had ever existed. And they wanted to do it while convincing her it was for her own good, that she was too old and stupid to know what was best for herself. Margaret cried until her throat was raw and swollen. She cried until her eyes burned and no more tears would come. She cried until the sun began to rise, painting the bedroom in shades of pink and gold that Robert had always loved. Somewhere in those dark hours, in the absolute lowest point of her life, something inside Margaret changed. The grief was still there, crushing and overwhelming, but beneath it, something else began to grow, something hard and sharp and absolutely unwilling to be destroyed. Margaret woke on the morning of her 69th birthday with startling clarity, the kind that comes only after surviving your darkest night. She'd cried herself into exhaustion sometime around dawn, collapsing into a fitful sleep, still clutching Robert's wedding photo. Now, with morning light flooding through the curtains, she sat up in bed and felt fundamentally different. The grief was still there, a constant ache in her chest, but it no longer paralyzed her. She looked at Robert's photo on the nightstand, really looked at it, and suddenly heard his voice in her memory. Not the weakened voice from his final days, but the strong, vital voice from their life together. She remembered an incident from 20 years ago when a contractor had tried to overcharge them for roof repairs, treating them like ignorant marks. Robert had been ready to pay until Margaret researched the actual costs and confronted the man with evidence of his fraud. Robert had laughed afterward and said, "Remind me never to underestimate you, Maggie. You're tougher than you look." She was tougher than she looked. She'd survived immigrating parents who worked themselves to exhaustion. She'd survived 35 years in underfunded public schools, dealing with difficult administrators and impossible budgets. She'd survived losing the love of her life and kept going. She would survive this too. Margaret stood up, her joints protesting after a sleepless night, and walked to Robert's side of the closet. She pulled out his old navy cardigan, the one that still faintly smelled like his cologne and pipe tobacco. She wrapped it around herself like armor. "They think I'm a helpless old woman," she said out loud to Robert's photo. "Let's show them what this old woman can do." Her hands were steady as she made coffee, no longer shaking with shock and grief. She sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and began making calls. First was Patricia Holloway, her lawyer friend who'd handled Robert's estate. Patricia answered on the second ring. "Patricia, it's Margaret Chen. I need help. My son is trying to steal my house." The words came out clear and strong, no tears, no hesitation. Patricia arrived by noon with a briefcase full of legal documents, her expression fierce and protective. They sat at Margaret's dining room table, the same table where Rachel had spread those brochures just 2 weeks ago, and Patricia laid out Margaret's options with clinical precision. "Margaret, what they're attempting is textbook elder financial abuse. It's a felony in this state. We have multiple charges we could pursue: fraud, conspiracy, attempted theft by deception. We can not only stop them, we can prosecute them criminally." Margaret thought about her grandson, innocent in all of this. She thought about David's future, his career, his freedom. She thought about family loyalty and the bond between mother and child. Then she thought about Rachel's email. Once we have the house, we can cut her off completely. She thought about David calculating her life expectancy, like she was a stock investment with a projected return date. "Tell me everything we can do," Margaret said, her voice like steel. "Every legal option, every protection, every consequence they'll face. I want them to understand exactly who they tried to destroy." Patricia smiled, the kind of smile a warrior gives before battle. Then let's get to work. They spent the next 4 hours building Margaret's defense and her counterattack, transforming her from victim into fighter. Margaret's plan was elegant in its simplicity, designed with the precision of a retired teacher who'd spent decades managing chaos and outsmarting difficult people. With Patricia's guidance, she transformed from grieving mother into strategic opponent, and the shift felt oddly empowering. The first step was protection. Patricia drew up an irrevocable living trust, placing Margaret's house and all assets inside it with an independent trustee, Patricia's law firm. The documents were airtight, drafted by specialists in elder law. David couldn't touch any of it now, couldn't manipulate or coerce or steal. Everything Margaret owned was locked behind legal walls he'd never breach. They filed the trust documents that same afternoon, and Margaret felt the first flutter of safety she'd experienced in weeks. But protection wasn't enough. Margaret wanted justice, and more than that, she wanted them to expose themselves completely. "We need to let them think they're winning," Patricia explained, spreading documents across Margaret's kitchen table. "We set a trap, let them walk into it willingly, and capture everything on record." Margaret called David that evening, and the performance she gave would have made Robert proud. Her voice trembled perfectly, elderly and defeated. "David, sweetheart, I've been thinking about what you and Rachel said, about Sunset Meadows and the house. You're right. I am lonely here. I'm just a foolish old woman rattling around in too much space." She could hear the excitement David tried to hide. "Mom, I'm so glad you're being reasonable about this. It really is for the best. Could we meet Sunday? Here at the house? I'd like to move forward with your plan." The words tasted like acid, but Margaret kept her voice soft and compliant. "Absolutely. We'll bring all the paperwork. This is going to be so good for you, Mom." What David didn't know was that Patricia would be there too, hidden in Robert's old study with a notary and professional recording equipment. Margaret would wear a wire. Every word, every admission, every cruel calculation would be captured in crystal clarity. But Margaret didn't stop. There, she made more calls, her confidence growing with each conversation. She contacted David's half-siblings from Robert's first marriage, people David had systematically excluded from family events for years. "I need witnesses to a family matter," she told them. "It's time you knew who your brother really is." She called an investigative journalist named Sarah Chen from the Philadelphia Inquirer, someone who'd written extensively about elder abuse. "I have a story for you," Margaret said, complete with documentation and recorded confessions. She even prepared evidence folders, one for each person who'd attend Sunday's gathering. Inside each folder, copies of the emails Marcus had uncovered, photos of the documents from Rachel's box, bank statements showing the suspicious transfers, timelines of the conspiracy. Every folder was organized with the meticulous attention to detail of a woman who'd spent 35 years grading papers and tracking student progress. Patricia helped Margaret practice her lines like an actress rehearsing for the performance of her life. "Get them to say it all out loud," Patricia coached. "We need explicit admissions of intent. Ask questions that make them explain their reasoning." Saturday night, Margaret laid out her best dress, the sapphire blue one Robert had always said made her eyes sparkle. She ironed it carefully, prepared her questions, and slept better than she had in months. Tomorrow, her son would learn that the helpless old woman he'd planned to exploit was actually a force he should have feared. Sunday arrived with perfect autumn weather, the kind of crisp October day that made Philadelphia look like a painting. Sunlight streamed through windows that would remain Margaret's no matter what happened in the next few hours. She dressed in her sapphire blue dress, the one Robert had loved, and applied lipstick with hands that didn't shake. Looking in the mirror, she saw a different woman than the one who'd sobbed in this bedroom 2 weeks ago. This woman had steel in her spine. Patricia arrived at noon to set up equipment in Robert's old study. She positioned recording devices, tested the wire Margaret would wear under her dress, and confirmed the notary was standing by. "Remember," Patricia whispered, "let them talk. The more they say, the stronger our case." David and Rachel arrived at 1 o'clock, exactly on time, eager and smiling like wolves approaching wounded prey. Rachel carried the baby in his carrier, using him like a prop of innocence and family love. Margaret felt her heart twist seeing her grandson, knowing this might be the last time she'd hold him, but she forced herself to stay focused. "Mom, you look beautiful," David said, kissing her cheek. The betrayal of that kiss, the casual intimacy of it, nearly broke Margaret's resolve. This was her son, the boy she'd rocked through nightmares, nursed through illnesses, celebrated through triumphs. How had they arrived at this moment? "Come in, sweetheart. I made your favorite cookies." Margaret's voice was steady, warm, perfectly grandmotherly. She'd baked chocolate chip cookies that morning, filling the house with the comforting smell of vanilla and brown sugar, creating an atmosphere of normalcy and trust. They settled at the dining room table, the same table where they'd presented their plan 2 weeks ago. Rachel spread out the papers with practiced efficiency, titled transfer documents, power of attorney forms, applications for Sunset Meadows. Everything was organized in neat stacks, ready for Margaret's signature to seal her own destruction. "We're so proud of you for making this decision, Mom," David said, squeezing her hand across the table. His touch felt like a spider crawling on her skin, but Margaret smiled and squeezed back. Rachel's smile was wide and satisfied. "This is going to be such a positive change for you. You'll see. Sunset Meadows is beautiful, and you won't have to worry about maintaining this big house anymore." Margaret picked up the pen they'd provided, letting her hand tremble slightly. The wire taped to her chest felt obvious, like they must surely see it, but they were too focused on the documents to notice anything wrong. "Before I sign," she said softly, playing her part perfectly, "I just want to understand one more time. This is really for the best? You really think I should give up my home?" David nodded solemnly, his face the picture of concerned, filial devotion. "Mom, you're getting older. What if you fall down those stairs? What if you have a medical emergency and no one finds you for days? We're trying to protect you. This house is just too much responsibility for someone your age. And you'll take care of everything? The sale, the finances, all of it?" Rachel leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "Absolutely. You won't have to worry about a single thing. We'll handle the property, get top dollar for it. The real estate market is excellent right now. Your house could sell for close to $1 million. $1 million, Margaret repeated slowly. "And what happens to that money?" "Well, after we pay off the fees and commissions, we'll invest the rest for your care," David explained. "Brett's firm will manage it. You remember Brett, my friend from college? He's excellent with estate planning." Margaret's finger hovered over the signature line. The pen felt heavy as a weapon. "And after I'm gone? What happens then?" Rachel and David exchanged a quick glance, communicating silently. "Then it becomes part of the estate," Rachel said carefully, "for your grandson's future." Margaret set down the pen and looked directly at her son. "When did you plan this, David? When did you decide to steal my home?" The temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. David's smile faltered. "Mom, that's not what—" The doorbell rang, cutting him off. Rachel's face went pale. "Who else is coming?" Margaret smiled, and it was nothing like the gentle grandmother's smile from moments before. Everyone who should witness this. Patricia entered first, her heels clicking authoritatively on Margaret's hardwood floors as she introduced herself. "Patricia Holloway, Mrs. Chen's attorney. I've been listening to this entire conversation from the next room." She held up a recording device, its red light blinking steadily. David shot to his feet so fast his chair toppled backward with a crash. "What is this?" "This," Margaret said, her voice no longer trembling or elderly, "is the truth coming to light." The doorbell rang again, and Margaret nodded for Patricia to answer it. David's half-siblings entered. Robert's children from his first marriage. Michael and Jennifer, people David had excluded from family gatherings for years. Behind them came Sarah Chen, the investigative journalist with a camera operator. Then two police officers Patricia had contacted from the Elder Abuse Division. The dining room suddenly felt crowded, the walls closing in on David and Rachel. Rachel clutched the baby carrier, her knuckles white. You can't just bring strangers into a private family matter. Family matter? Margaret's laugh was bitter. Is that what you call stealing my home? Plotting to have me declared incompetent? Calculating how long until I die so you can maximize your inheritance? I don't know what you think you heard, but David started, his face flushed red. Patricia cut him off by pressing play on her recording device. The room filled with voices, Rachel and David's voices from moments ago, discussing the sale, the $1 million, managing Margaret's care through Brett's fraudulent firm. But then the recording shifted to something else, something that made Rachel gasp. It was her voice. Once the old man dies, we move on the mother. She'll be vulnerable and desperate for family connection. That's when we strike. Then David's voice. She's so desperate to feel useful that she'll sign anything if I tell her it's for her grandson. The key is keeping her emotionally dependent. Rachel's voice again. Once we have the house, we can cut her off completely. Mandatory visiting hours at Sunset Meadows are only once a month. The baby started crying, his wails filling the horrible silence that followed. Margaret watched her son's face drain of all color as his own words condemned him. Rachel tried to grab the recording device, but Patricia stepped back smoothly, keeping it out of reach. How did you... Rachel's voice cracked. Those were private emails. Nothing is private when you're committing felony elder abuse, Patricia said coolly. She turned to the police officers and handed them a thick folder. Officers, this contains documented evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted theft by deception, and elder financial exploitation. We have emails, bank records, forged documents, and now recorded confessions. Margaret stood, pulling the wire from beneath her dress and holding it up. Every word you said today, every lie, every manipulation, I recorded it all. Sarah's camera captured everything. Rachel's tears, David's panic, the damning documents spread across the table, the baby's innocent wails. Mrs. Chen, Sarah said gently, would you be willing to go on record about what your son attempted to do? Margaret looked directly into the camera, her voice steady and clear. My name is Margaret Chen. I'm 69 years old. My own son tried to steal my home, exploit my grief, and use my love for my grandson as a weapon, against me. This is what elder abuse looks like. It wears a familiar face and calls you mom while destroying your life. David found his voice, desperate and pleading. Mom, please, you don't understand. I understand perfectly, Margaret interrupted. I understand that you calculated my life expectancy, that you planned to demolish the home your father and I built, that you called him the old man, like he was an obstacle instead of the father who raised you. Her voice broke slightly, but she pushed through. I understand that you never loved me. You just loved what you thought you could take from me. The police officers stepped forward. Mr. Reeves, Mrs. Reeves, you need to come with us. We have some questions about these allegations. The fallout was swift and utterly devastating. David and Rachel were arrested that afternoon, led out of Margaret's house in handcuffs, while neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching in shocked silence. The baby was temporarily placed with Rachel's parents, who were horrified when they learned what their daughter had done. Margaret's heart broke watching her grandson being carried away, but she knew she'd made the only choice possible. The criminal charges came first: attempted elder financial exploitation, conspiracy to commit fraud, and forgery of legal documents. Pennsylvania took elder abuse seriously, and with Patricia's evidence and Margaret's recordings, the case was ironclad. David and Rachel tried to fight it initially, hiring an expensive lawyer who quickly advised them to accept a plea deal when he saw the mountain of evidence against them. They both pled guilty. David received 2 years in prison and 5 years probation. Rachel received 18 months in probation. But the legal consequences were just the beginning of their destruction. The story went viral within 48 hours of Sarah's article being published. Philadelphia teacher turned hero exposes son's cruel betrayal was shared hundreds of thousands of times across social media. The public outrage was fierce and unrelenting. People who'd never met Margaret sent her flowers, letters of support, and donations she didn't need but appreciated for what they represented, validation that she'd done the right thing. David lost his job 3 days after the story broke. His company, a prestigious financial consulting firm, released a statement saying they cannot employ individuals convicted of financial crimes and elder abuse. Rachel's real estate sister, Diane, faced ethics investigations from her licensing board for her role in the conspiracy. Several of her clients dropped her, citing moral concerns. Rachel and David's friends abandoned them. Their church asked them not to return. The financial ruin was perhaps most fitting. Legal fees consumed the $60,000 they'd saved for a house down payment. Court-ordered restitution required them to pay Margaret $50,000 for emotional, distress, and legal costs, money they didn't have and would be paying off for years. David's friend Brett lost his financial advisor license when investigators discovered the fraudulent fee structure he'd designed. The life insurance money they'd planned to steal remained safely in Margaret's control, untouched and protected. Most devastating for them, Margaret removed David from her will entirely. With Patricia's help, she created a new estate plan, leaving everything to charities, organizations fighting elder abuse, scholarships for underprivileged students, and the library where she volunteered. David would inherit nothing. The house he'd tried to steal would be sold after her death, and every penny would go to people who deserved it. The court also granted Margaret a restraining order. David and Rachel were barred from contacting her, coming within 500 feet of her home, or attempting any communication. It was like they'd never existed. Margaret kept her home, her dignity, and her freedom. She changed the locks, planted new roses in her garden, and converted David's childhood bedroom into an art studio. She'd always wanted to paint but had sacrificed that dream for family obligations. Now she took classes at the community center and discovered she had talent. Her paintings, mostly landscapes of places she and Robert had visited, began filling her walls, replacing family photos she'd quietly taken down. She joined a support group for elder abuse survivors and became an advocate, sharing her story at senior centers and community meetings. She helped other elderly people recognize warning signs, protect their assets, and find the courage to fight back against family members who exploited them. She turned her pain into purpose, her betrayal into a mission. 6 months after that terrible Sunday, Margaret stood in her garden on a spring morning, Robert's roses blooming in glorious profusion around her. She was wearing paint-stained jeans and one of Robert's old flannel shirts, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking nothing like the proper grandmother she'd once tried to be. She felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Peace, maybe. Or pride. She'd fought back against people who'd tried to destroy her, and she'd won. She'd proven that age didn't mean weakness, that love didn't require accepting abuse, that even at 69 she was still strong enough to protect herself. Margaret still keeps one photograph of David, though she moved it from the mantel to a drawer in Robert's old desk. It's from his childhood, maybe 7 or 8 years old, gap-toothed and grinning at the camera while holding up a finger painting he'd made for Mother's Day. In the photo, his eyes are bright with uncomplicated love, before greed and entitlement corrupted whatever goodness had once lived in his heart. She looks at it sometimes, usually late at night when sleep won't come, and grieves not for what she lost, but for what he became. She wonders what happened to that little boy. Where did the transformation occur? Was it something she did wrong? Some crucial lesson she failed to teach? Or was it Rachel's influence, her materialistic values slowly poisoning David's character? Margaret has spent countless hours in therapy exploring these questions, and her therapist keeps telling her the same thing. Some people choose greed over love, and that choice isn't the fault of the people they betray. The baby she never got to know is almost a year old now. Margaret sees updates occasionally through mutual acquaintances. He's walking, he's saying words, he looks happy. He's being raised by parents who taught him that family is transactional, that elderly people are disposable, that love has a price tag measured in real estate value. That's their tragedy to bear, not hers. That child will grow up never knowing his grandmother, never hearing stories about his grandfather Robert, never learning that he came from people who valued integrity over money. Rachel and David stole that from him as surely as they tried to steal Margaret's home. Margaret learned the hardest lesson life can teach. Sometimes the people you sacrifice everything for are the ones who'll sacrifice you for nothing. She gave David everything: her time, her money, her unconditional love, her very identity as a mother. She worked 2 jobs to pay for his education. She postponed her dreams to fund his. She poured herself into raising him, believing that love and sacrifice would create a good man. Instead, she created someone who saw her as an obstacle to wealth, who calculated her death date like a stock portfolio maturity. But she also learned something else, something perhaps more important. Family isn't defined by blood. It's defined by respect, by honesty, by love that doesn't come with conditions or price tags. Real family doesn't calculate your worth based on your life expectancy or the appraised value of your property. Real family doesn't see you as wasted space in a valuable house. Real family doesn't strategize about when to move on you after your husband dies. Margaret rebuilt her life on those principles, and in doing so, she found a family that actually deserved her. Her support group friends check on her daily. Her stepchildren, Michael and Jennifer, once excluded by David, now visit regularly and call her mom. Her former students, now adults with children of their own, invite her to graduations and weddings. The community she serves through her advocacy work treats her with genuine respect and affection. She's surrounded by people who value her for who she is, not what she owns. She still misses Robert every single day. She still talks to his photo during morning coffee on the porch swing he built. She still sleeps on her side of the bed, unable to claim his space even 3 years after his death. But she no longer feels completely alone. She has purpose, dignity, and the deep satisfaction of knowing she fought for herself when it mattered most. Sometimes Margaret thinks about what would have happened if she'd signed those papers, if she'd trusted David's lies and surrendered everything. She'd be in Sunset Meadows right now, her home sold and demolished, her money drained through fraudulent fees, visiting hours limited to once a month with a son who couldn't be bothered to show up. She'd be erased, forgotten, warehoused until death. The thought makes her physically ill, but it also makes her grateful for that Tuesday afternoon when she found Rachel's box, for the courage to investigate, for the strength to fight back. Trust is earned, not owed, even from family, especially from family. Blood relation doesn't automatically deserve your blind faith or unconditional surrender. Protect yourself, know your worth, and never let anyone make you feel disposable, no matter how much you love them or how desperately you want to believe in their goodness. Your life, your home, and your dignity are not negotiable, no matter who's asking you to give them up. You are never too old, too vulnerable, or too lonely to deserve respect and honesty. And when someone shows you who they really are through their actions, believe them the first time, no matter how much it hurts. What would you do in Margaret's situation? Would you forgive your child and try to rebuild the relationship? Or would you press charges like she did? Is blood thicker than betrayal? Or are some violations too severe to overlook? Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely, someone you never imagined could hurt you? How did you handle it? Share your thoughts and your stories in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else facing a similar situation. If this story touched you, moved you, or made you think differently about family loyalty and self-protection, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, true stories every week, stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the courage to fight back. Your subscription helps us reach more people who need these messages. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, maybe an elderly parent or grandparent, maybe a friend who's being pressured by family, maybe someone who's struggling with whether to trust people who are asking for too much, please share this video with them. Sometimes the stories we need most are the ones that remind us of our own strength, our own worth, our own right to protect what's ours. Thank you for watching, and remember, you are never too old to fight for what's yours. You are never too vulnerable to demand respect. You are never too loving to require honesty. Your value doesn't decrease with age, and your home, your assets, and your autonomy belong to you until you decide otherwise. Stand strong, protect yourself, and never apologize for refusing to be exploited. What's your take? Let us know in the comments. We'll see you in the next story.